November 18th, 2006, the day that Johnny King shot the new typical world record, or so he thought. The opening day of deer season is a rich tradition no matter what state you are in. Some schools have the day off, camps and farms are packed with cars, and small quiet little towns turn into miniature cities for a few days with the influx of people. That same tradition was carried down from generation to generation for the King family since the 1950s on their Grant County, Wisconsin farm. That November morning started off just like any other opening day for Johnny King. He woke up early, headed to his mother's house, and had breakfast with his family, as was tradition for opening day of gun season. After breakfast, Johnny and his brother headed off to the family farm, where their uncle was already gutting a buck that he had shot 15 minutes into the season. He told them he didn't need any help and to get in the woods as soon as they could. The morning went by with no deer in sight, so the family regrouped around lunchtime and came up with a game plan to put on some drives. The first drive produced no deer, so the family regrouped again and moved on to the next drive, where Johnny positioned himself above a large draw coming out of a thicket. Not even minutes into the drive, a giant buck ran up the ravine in front of Johnny before he was even set up, heading straight for the drivers. A few moments later, a shot rang out from the direction of the drivers, and shortly after, the large buck again ran the ravine in front of Johnny. This time he was ready though. He lined up the iron sights on his 30-30 and took the 150-yard shot. The buck reared up and took off, and Johnny took two more shots as the buck was running down the ravine. He thought he had made a good shot, but began doubting himself when the buck didn't slow down at all. He then crawled up a fence line along the draw to see if the giant was still in the area. To his amazement, the buck stood up 75 yards away. He raised his gun and again fired a shot, only to watch the giant bound away again. At this point, the drive had still yet to begin, so he waited 45 agonizing minutes for the drivers to finish their push so that he could get some help with locating the buck again. Toward the end of the drive, he heard another shot ring out from the woods, and his cousin yelled, "Big buck." The buck again ran in front of Johnny, and he again fired a shot. Once out of sight, Johnny took off and relocated the buck, running down the hill. Down to his last bullet, Johnny lined up the iron sights one more time and dropped the giant buck with his last shot. His cousin Brad was now there, and they both quickly approached the deer. To their surprise, the buck jumped up again, and Johnny, being fresh out of ammo, yelled for Brad to shoot. Brad put one last shot into the deer, and it was finally over. The big buck was down for good. The two shared congratulations, and Brad leaned down to pick up the massive rack. To his surprise, the whole entire left antler popped off in his hand. Apparently, when Johnny took the first shot at the buck and thought he'd hit it, he in fact hit the buck in the rack just below the brow tine. Even with the broken rack, a recent rule change in the Boone and Crockett bylaws allowed Johnny to have the rack repaired and officially scored. In early 2007, a Boone and Crockett official score measured the buck at a gross typical score of 220 6/8 inches, netting a whopping 213 6/8 inches, potentially overtaking Milo Hansen for the new typical world record. The official measurer cautioned Johnny, though, that the panel score might not accept all 12 points as typical tines. The G3s were really close to being measured as abnormal points, potentially putting Johnny's buck into the non-typical category. The official told Johnny to take the rack to a Boone and Crockett panel of judges to know for sure. That year, Pope & Young was conducting its 25th National Convention and Awards Banquet in late April in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. A panel of Boone and Crockett judges was going to be there to help with measuring, so Johnny and his dad drove the 1,200 miles to have the rack panel scored. With high hopes, Johnny and his dad took the rack into the banquet. Unfortunately, however, the panel looked at Johnny's incredible rack and ruled that it would have to be scored as a mainframe 5x5 with abnormal G3s because of the common bases that the G2s and G3s shared. This put the what-if buck into the non-typical category, knocking him out of contention for the new typical world record. Johnny took the news in stride and returned home. He later took his awesome trophy to get repaired for the mount, but the surprises didn't end there. On May 15, 2007, his trophy rack was scored by Buckmasters at 198 5/8 inches, making it at the time the new Buckmasters world record in the perfect category. Buckmasters does not include an inside spread measurement, which makes this rack that much more impressive to have almost hit 200 inches without any inside spread measurements. With matching 29-inch main beams and the smallest mass measurement coming in at 5 1/8 inch, the rack is truly world class. Its inside spread measured 21 2/8 inches, and 6 of its 12 scoreable points measured over 10 inches long. It seems like controversy always surrounds world-class whitetails, and the king buck is no exception. The debate rages on to this day on whether or not Boone and Crockett made a mistake on how the deer was to be scored. The one thing that is certain, though, is that there's no doubt that the Johnny King buck is truly a once-in-a-lifetime deer.